This presentation is about the United States entry into World War I, not about the war as a whole, but it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about the background of World War I. There were two opposing alliances. Over 100 countries were involved in the war, the great majority on the side of the Allies. But the major nations on the Allied side were Britain, France, Russia, Italy, who joined a few months into the war, and then the United States, who joined far into the war. The war began in August of 1914. The United States did not enter until April of 1917. Opposing them were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Now, to see the same thing on a map, here you can see the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, who joined a bit later, versus Russia. Poland here was part of Russia at the time, or at least the part of Poland was. And then in the west you had France, Britain, and then Italy joined a few months into the war. Now, in the United States, it was far from obvious what the United States would do. About a third of Americans were either foreign-born or had at least one foreign-born parent. And many of those were of German or Irish ancestry, and those groups of Americans usually favored the Central Powers. Of course, Germany, being one of them, and Irish Americans opposing Britain, and therefore favoring the German side by default. There were Anglo-Americans, Italians, and many Slavic peoples, such as Poles and Czechs, who favored the Allies. Now, during that long period, 2 years and 8 months, between the time the war began and the time the U.S. entered the war, there were a number of events that nudged the United States in the direction of war. The British, in a very shrewd move, cut off the transatlantic cable to Germany. They wanted to control American public opinion, and that meant that information about the war coming from Europe had to go through Britain, and they very carefully selected and censored what would get through to the United States. The United States traded much more with the Allies, especially Britain and France, than they did with the Central Powers, and this gave us a certain amount of bias toward the Allies. There was a major event in May of 1915. A British passenger liner, the Lusitania, was sunk by a German submarine. Almost 1,200 people died, and 128 of them were Americans. The U.S. protested strongly, but did not enter the war at that point. It's a common misconception that the Lusitania was the reason the U.S. entered the war, but it was almost 2 years after that before the United States really did. This was a passenger ship. It came out later that in its hold it was carrying a lot of arms and ammunition. That's something that wasn't publicly known at the time. A few months later, in March of 1916, there was a French ferry boat called the Sussex, which the Germans sunk. There were around 50 dead. None of them were Americans, but it was so outrageous to many people that President Wilson protested this. And the Germans did not want to see the United States enter the war for obvious reasons, so they issued what was called the Sussex Pledge. They would not target passenger ships. They would not sink merchant ships unless there were weapons found after they had searched them, and they would assure safety to the passengers and crew of a ship that they attacked. Now that, unfortunately, was difficult to do because U-boats, submarines, are very small, and they really have no way of uh, picking up the survivors once they've attacked another ship. In 1916, the war was, of course, a major issue. Uh, the Democrat Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election against the Republican Charles Evans Hughes. And the slogan that may well have turned the tide for Wilson was, "He kept us out of war." Uh, Hughes, on the other hand, called for greater preparedness, was a little bit more hawkish, a little more likely to be belligerent than Wilson was, but he did not call for a U.S. entry into the war. He got the endorsement of Teddy Roosevelt, who was extremely aggressive. He was, ready to go to war. Now, this was a very close election. Uh, Wilson, both in the electoral vote and the popular vote, had Hughes won a few thousand more votes in California, he would have been the president. But Wilson narrowly won re-election, and his slogan, "He kept us out of war," probably made the difference. Uh, the candidates you see pictured here, uh, and if you look at the map, uh, Wilson, as the Democrat, carried the South. The solid South was almost uniformly Democratic during that whole period. Uh, the Republican carried a lot of northeastern and midwestern industrial states. Of course, those are vote-rich states with a lot of electoral votes, and this helps to explain why the election was so close. In March of 1917, just the last few weeks before U.S. entry, there were critical events that took place. There were attacks on U.S. shipping. Germany formally abandoned the Sussex Pledge. They were gambling that they could knock Britain out of the war before the United States could arrive in sufficient numbers to make a difference. They had no doubts about the potential of the United States to be a game changer, but the United States was not mobilized. It would take a year for that to happen, more or less. So Germany, who was in a desperate situation, gambled everything to try one last final assault to knock Britain out of the war and win the war. 3 U.S. merchant ships were sunk in these attacks. The second critical event was also a gamble by Germany. They sent a telegram from their foreign minister, Zimmerman, to Mexico. And this was intercepted by the British and made public on the 1st of March, 1917. What the Zimmerman telegram said was that if Mexico would attack the United States, then when Germany won the war, they would see to it that Mexico received the territory back that they had lost in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48. That would be the whole southwestern United States, states like New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, etc. This was not taken seriously by the Wilson administration. It was absurd. Mexico was in no position to reclaim all that territory militarily, and Germany certainly was in no position to wage war across the Atlantic. They were extended to the max in Europe. They couldn't even get their fleet out of port. So those who really knew what was going on did not see this as a serious threat. However, the way it played in the court of American public opinion was a different matter. Americans were outraged by that, and that helped push them in the direction of war with Germany. The other event that happened that year is that the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, was overthrown. Russia, at least temporarily, was made a republic. Now, what they didn't know at the time was that in November, the Russian government that had overthrown the Tsar would itself be overthrown, by the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Uh, but for a time, it looked as though uh, Russia was becoming more democratic, and that took away one of the arguments of the anti-war groups. They believed that it was hypocritical, it was foolish to say that we're fighting a war for democracy when Russia was on that one side, because Russia under the Tsar was anything but democratic, and now that argument was no longer being made. Wilson was very idealistic. There's even a phrase called Wilsonian idealism. That meant that he believed that a perfect world, or at least a vastly better world, was possible and within reach. He called this a war to make the world safe for democracy and a war to end all wars. Uh, those were extremely and overblown statements. Unfortunately, neither one of them ever came close to happening. Uh, when the U.S. formally declared war, when Wilson signed the declaration on April 6th, it was against Germany only. It was not against the other Central Powers. 4 days earlier, on April 2nd, he addressed a joint session of Congress to ask for this declaration of war. This decision by Woodrow Wilson has been debated ever since. Did the United States really need to enter World War I? There are some pretty formidable arguments that suggest the answer is no. There was absolutely no threat at all to the U.S. homeland. Germany, as I've said, was already overextended in Europe. Their navy was bottled up in port. It was completely out of the question that they could have threatened the United States. The war also had, at least in the eyes of many people, nothing to do with American vital interests. Nations normally fight wars to protect what is most important to them, and the war was not really threatening what was most important to the United States. The U-boat campaign, the attacks on merchant ships, were beginning to fail. And shortly after this, convoys, taking large numbers of ships and protecting them with destroyers and submarine chasers, would start to work very well. So by late in the war, 99% of the shipping was successfully getting through to Britain. In this war, there were no good guys. I think most historians would call it an unnecessary war. It made no sense to go to war in the first place. And the killing was absolutely senseless. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers dying in order to gain land that was militarily worthless. It gave the lie to the view that Europe was the most civilized place on earth. Nothing that had ever been done was any less civilized than World War I. Wars are also unpredictable, and they can result in all kinds of unintended consequences. And in hindsight, we know that one of those unintended consequences was World War II and the rise of Hitler, which resulted in tens of millions of deaths, far more deaths than in World War I. Now, there was no way to know this, but it was known that war was unpredictable. And what could have been known, what was predictable, was that if the German power was completely defeated, there could be a nationalist reaction from an extremist in Germany. And of course, that is a good description of what Hitler was. So why did the U.S. enter the war? Well, the reasons that you hear quoted all the time are the ones that we've already discussed. The attacks on neutral shipping, the Zimmerman telegram, the change of power in Russia. But a lot of it was simply Wilson's belief that he could remake the world in a way that would prevent future wars, based on his 14 points, he called them, and on his goal of a League of Nations, an international organization that would prevent war. Um, the This never came close to working, uh, and a lot of historians would argue that that was predictable, that we could have known that. Uh, what is undisputable is that some major U.S. companies were at financial risk if Britain and France had lost the war. Specifically, the J.P. Morgan financial empire had loaned enormous amounts of money to the Western Allies, to Britain and France, and they were certainly in favor of the United States entering the war. How much weight you give to this is up to you, but it is a factor, and it should be mentioned. So even at this time, there is a lot of debate about whether the United States should have entered World War I. And in fact, there was a good deal of debate back then as well. Once we entered the war, there was no more debate, and those who questioned it were likely to wind up in prison.